Fresh off the back of Corruption, I immediately started production on my next project, A Tale of the First Fireteam to Crack the Vault of Glass. My overriding memory of Shatterproof is that it was a short but difficult shoot, which of course would be expected given the raid setting. Unlike with Corruption and Crota's Bane, where Daniel saved all the raw footage we shot, I deleted all of the raw footage for Shatterproof when I uploaded it, so all that remains is the actual finished film, which does limit what I can show visually on screen here, but even so, there's a lot to dig in, so let's get started. The script for Shatterproof actually went through a couple of revisions. I started writing it towards the end of the shoot for Corruption, and it was the first script that I'd really properly written by myself. I therefore had to decide on the structure of the film, which wasn't difficult because it's the exact same structure as Crota's Bane. It's in two halves. The first half is assembling the team, and the second half is the raid, where all the fighting and action and dying happens. There are several differences though between Shatterproof and Crota's Bane. First of all, there's only 3 characters in Shatterproof's raid as opposed to 6 in Crota's Bane. Secondly, there's essentially no source material. With Crota's Bane and Corruption, there were multiple scenes which were lifted straight from the grimoire, the dialogue fully intact and scripted verbatim. Shatterproof has essentially none of that. The grimoire is actually very vague on what actually happens in the vault. Cabor dies, Praedyth has lost time, and Pahanin escapes, but other than that, the specifics were at my discretion. One of those specifics came down to Praedyth's class. I wrote him as a hunter, purely because the Praedyth Revenge Sniper always struck me as a hunter's weapon, but once Shatterproof came out, I had a few comments saying that Praedyth was, in fact, a warlock. Now, let's kind of make this clear. The grimoire does not actually explicitly say what class Praedyth is. Destinypedia lists his class as Warlock, but offers absolutely zero sources for this claim, and Ishtar Collective, a lore website with more rigorous editing policies, doesn't specify his class either. After the release of Shatterproof, I trawled through the grimoire searching for evidence as to Praedyth's class, but I found nothing. If you manage to find any definitive proof, then please let me know, but as it stands, my Praedyth is a hunter, and although it contradicts some people's headcanons, it doesn't contradict the lore. Elsewhere, I try to be as accurate as possible with my characterizations of the core Fireteam members. Cabor is arrogant and blinded by the promise of glory, Praedyth is cautious and introspective, and Pahanin is, for want of a better phrase, something of a clown. He's part comic relief, part unpredictable wildcard, and his energy here lends an extra sense of pathos to his death and corruption, partially because you get to see how full of life he was in contrast to his murder, where he's alone and terrified. At first I had planned for Shatterproof to be a full-length movie on the scale of Corruption and Crota's Bane, but after my first draft of the script, which was just over 6,000 words, I read it back and had some doubts about it. This was during May of 2018, and I wanted Shatterproof to be completed before the summer was out, mostly because I didn't trust myself that I wouldn't fall into the same patterns of lethargy and not actually working on the project that I'd practiced with Crota's Bane and Corruption. Another factor was that the Forsaken expansion was coming out in September, and that would likely take up at least a month or 2 of my time at minimum. Given this reduced timescale, I decided to scale back my plans a little bit, changing the project from a full-length movie to something more akin to a short. I cut out a number of scenes. One of them was Cabor visiting the Ishtar archives just after killing the Gate Lord, and another scene was where the 3 Guardians discussed their plans just before entering the vault. I also reduced a lot of dialogue that I thought was useless or overlong, and this ended up chopping the scripts down to about 5,300 words. This, I thought, was workable. The first half of the film wasn't too challenging to shoot. The major challenge was Cabor's design. As he was wearing the full set of Vault of Glass gear, I had to grind out that entire set on my Titan, which took a very annoyingly long time. I'd started grinding before Corruption came out, but I didn't acquire the full set until just after the shoot for Shatterproof had started. So in the meantime, I relied on other body actors to stand in for Cabor, especially in scenes where all 3 Guardians are in the vault and I had to act as a cameraman. But for the most part, the first half of the movie is just discussion scenes, and the small amounts of action are usually shot with just Cabor in frame. The hard part was the entire second half of the film. Due to a glitch with the Vault of Glass where you can open up the door alone, and also due to the fact that the Paradox story mission exists, I didn't really run up against any issues until the shot where Caper suddenly appeared with the Aegis. The Aegis requires a Templar checkpoint, which is well beyond the abilities of any solo player. So what I did was I joined LFG groups running the Vault of Glass, which wasn't too difficult in the post-Age of Triumph era, actually, at least when Vault of Glass was the weekly featured raid. Then I'd swap characters after clearing the oracles, which secured me a Templar checkpoint for that character I'd swapped out of. Later on in the run I could repeat the process by switching to my third character if I needed a checkpoint for Gorgons, or the Glass Throne, or Atheon. This is how I got my checkpoints for pretty much every scene that's filmed in the actual raid, with one major exception that we'll get to. For almost all of the scenes in and around the Gorgon's Labyrinth, however, I actually used the story mission Paradox, since it doesn't actually have the Gorgons and it's soloable in a way that the raid isn't. But anyways, back to the Aegis. Even with a pre-secured checkpoint, filming this was extraordinarily difficult. The red oracles will kill you pretty damn fast if you don't zip around the arena destroying them, and they will not stop spawning if you're not keeping the Templar's shield down. The entire encounter has basically zero downtime, which makes filming really tricky. My solution was to enlist Daniel's help, which is one of the very few times post-corruption where he ever held a controller during a filming session. I had him as a cameraman and I'd body act Caper myself, hoping to get some dialogue shots in when the Templar's back was turned. The brief combat scenes were slightly easier to stage, although it was a challenge for Daniel to avoid dying. Because the LFG groups I joined mostly ran Vault at light level 390, and Daniel was only light level 370, he would die in just a few hits from the Templar, which meant a lot of failed takes to what amounts for a few dozen seconds of footage. Now, remember how I said I got my checkpoints from LFGing with one major exception? Well, talking of that exception, by some unholy miracle of having the right people online at the right time and being lucky enough to have an entire day uninterrupted, I managed to schedule a combination raid run / body acting session with myself, fellow director Digital Curse, Daniel who was AFK for almost the entire raid, and 3 other people who were part of Digital's regular body acting crew. We ran the 390 version of Vault of Glass and things went relatively smoothly with me switching characters for checkpoints until we got to Atheon. Now, I'd had the idea of using this session to shoot the scene where Praedyth is trapped in time, represented here by the Mars past bit, mostly because it looks more barren and desolate and depressing than the Venus future bit. The reason why I decided to shoot this scene with the raid run with the body actors is because that short scene in the Mars future takes an entire raid team working in tandem to engineer the circumstances for all the setup for that scene to happen. The plan was that the team running the Glass Throne encounter would activate the Mars gate and hold it open. I, as Praedyth, would jump into the gate and Daniel, as the cinematographer, would follow. Unfortunately, this plan was hampered by several issues, the key issue being that the plan was very, very poorly thought out. For starters, the Mars past has the Marked by the Void debuff, which slowly blinds you. This can be cleansed with the Aegis, however that requires a third person to be in the Mars past zone, and it requires a third person to coordinate with, and it leaves only 3 people outside to defend the play and get on with the encounter. But that was just the annoying bit. Which caused us so much grief was the fact that we were playing on the 390 version of the raid. Daniel was still only at 370 light, and I was in a separate account for body acting Praedyth where my maximum light was about 340 if I remember correctly, and neither of us were allowed to die because there were no revives because this was Vault of Glass on 390 difficulty. Trying to set up that 30-second scene with a group of 5 other people who were all becoming increasingly frustrated was not a fun experience. So eventually we agreed that it would actually be faster to redo the raid all over again at level 26. So we did just that. It actually only took us about 25 or 30 minutes to get back up to the Glass Throne since we blitzed through the raid pretty quickly. And with the lower difficulty it was much easier to set up that scene inside the Mars Pass, and so we eventually did get all of the required footage. With that particular obstacle out of the way, and with all of the remaining Glass Throne footage successfully shot, there was little else to shoot but pickups, insert shots, and little bits and pieces to smooth over the cracks, most of which I knocked out pretty quickly and easily. Shatterproof was the first project in which the casting went truly and properly smoothly, or rather as smoothly as can be reasonably expected in machinima projects like these. Sometimes voice actors drop out, or have delays in getting lines in, or mispronounce words and have to do a bunch of retakes. None of these problems are disastrous, and all of them are easily fixable with a little bit of patience. These things happen, and there's no point in trying to demand perfection on the first take of anything. The most important factor that differentiates Shatterproof from Corruption and Crota's Bane is that all of the roles were cast in one go before shooting started. The fact that all of the lines were delivered in a reasonable time frame was also massively helpful, and it's what made Shatterproof take so much less time than Corruption and Crota's Bane, not just because it was shorter, but also because I was organised enough to cast and get the lines in pretty quickly. Although in fairness, the fact that all of the lines were delivered quickly pretty much came down to luck, because how quickly a voice actor can deliver lines varies wildly from person to person, and depends a lot on the actor's individual circumstances. The editing was the same process as ever, using Windows Movie Maker to both edit the individual scenes and also to string said scenes together into the final finished film. One relatively minor change came with regards to the music. Shatterproof marked the first time where not all of the music was sourced from the Destiny soundtracks. I still used the soundtracks of other video games to score my machinima, but this time I branched out into, for example, games like the Batman Arkham games and the Injustice and Gears of War series, amongst others. Music selection is quite an underrated part of constructing a machinima because you have to match the tone and style of the music to the scene. This is a lot easier when your music and visuals are coming from the same source, but after Crota's Bane and Corruption, I was frankly starting to run out of music from the Destiny soundtracks, because I try not to use the same piece of music twice unless there's a specific thematic reason for doing so. This meant that I had to be a little bit more thorough in my curation. In other words, I had to sift through a lot more music that I didn't think would work for the scenes that I was trying to score. But eventually, with all the lines in and all the music selected, I had the project completed and uploaded on the 3rd of September, which was just a day before Forsaken came out, which was pretty good timing if you ask me. Shatterproof is not necessarily my favourite of all the machinimas I've made, but that's not to say that I am not fond of it. Although I do think that the first half of the film is particularly weak with less than stellar scripting, the sections in the raid I think were remarkably well executed given the conditions that I had to work under being in the raid and all. Shatterproof is also the least relevant project in terms of its continuation into infinity as far as characters go. Only Pahanine, who'd already appeared in Corruption, gets any real development as a character beyond Shatterproof. But I can still look back in that summer with a sense of pride, as mixed as it is, because I learned a lot from making Shatterproof. I learned how to shoot efficiently in difficult combat scenarios, I learned how to deal with larger groups of people with the raid run that we did. I also learned how to work alone, how to see a project through from initial conception to final upload, almost entirely by myself. I couldn't rely on Daniel to chase up missing voice lines anymore, or give feedback in the script, so I had to be almost entirely self-reliant. Of course, like I've said before, no machinima is ever just the work of one person, and Shatterproof in particular relied heavily on the raiding skills of people who were far better at playing Destiny than me, as well as, of course, my hard-working body actors and voice actors. But the independence and self-reliance that I gained during the making of Shatterproof would be invaluable later down the line, when I began my next project, Phoenix Rising, and after that, Infinity.